Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to look at pagination, which is the ability to return just a subset of the results from your API to the users so that they can go page forward or page back, just the same as how Google search works. And we're going to tackle this in 3 different ways. First, we're going to build just the most basic pagination that you can build inside of an API. Secondly, we're going to take that a step further and we're going to make a nice middleware for our pagination so we can apply it to any of the resources in our API. And then third, we're going to hook up this simple section of our pagination to a database so that we actually have a real-world MongoDB database that we can paginate with our API. Let's get started now. As always, I just have a completely blank folder open in Visual Studio Code, and the very first thing we need to do is to run npm init with -y as the flag, and this is going to initialize our repository with a package.json. Next, we need to install the dependencies we're going to use. And since we're going to use a server, we need to install Express, which is going to be the framework for our server. Also, we're going to install a dev dependency by typing in --save dev, and this is going to be for NodeMon. And what NodeMon allows us to do is it automatically refreshes our server every single time we make changes. This way we don't have to manually stop and start our server every time we make changes. Now in the package.json, in order to use NodeMon, let's just create a simple script. We're going to call it dev start, and inside this script we just want to put nodemon, and we want to put our server.js file, just like this. And this is going to be a file that we're going to create now. So let's create that server.js, and this is going to be where all of our server code goes. So let's just make sure we save our package.json, and then inside of our server.js, let's set up the most basic Express server we can. So we want our Express variable, which we can get from the Express library. We can just say require Express, and then we also want to get the app portion of that, which is just calling this Express function, whoops, just like that. And then lastly, we can just say app.listen, and we can give it a port, for example, port 3000. And now if we come down here and we type npm run dev start, which is that command we just created, you'll see that our server is going to start up, and you see it starting node server.js, and our application is listening on port 3000. And this is great, but right now we aren't doing anything with this server, so let's set up our very first route, which is going to be getting a list of users. We can do that very simply by saying app.get, and we want to get users, so we can just say /users. And of course we have our request and our response variable. And in here, we just want to return our users. So we can just say response.json, and we want to return users. So let's just create that users variable. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the very first step is just a very simple pagination. We're not going to worry about the database. That's going to come later in the video. So for now, we're just going to create a users variable, and we're just going to set this to our own array. And inside of here, let's put our user objects. So our users are going to have, let's say, an ID of 1, and we're going to give them a name, for example, user1. And now I'm just going to copy this down a bunch of different times so we can simulate having a bunch of users. And I'm just going to increment all these numbers just like this, so 10, 11, 12, 13, and same thing for the names of the users. Just get all this out of the way. 10, 11, 12, 13, perfect. Now if we go down here, save this, you see our application restarted, and we can create a file over here, which is going to be called request.rest. And I'm using an extension in Visual Studio Code. This extension here is called REST client right here. And this allows me to make REST request inside of a file called .rest. For example, we can say that we want to get at localhost 3000. Make sure we put HTTP at the beginning, // and we want to get /users. Just like that. And you see the send request button. If I click that, you'll see it makes the request over here. And as you can see, we get our list of users returned to us in JSON. So we know that our application is actually working. Let's minimize all this, go back to our server. So we know that our users is working, but we actually want to be able to pass what page and what offset we want so that we can get only the resources we want and not the whole list. Because you can imagine this list could be thousands of users long, and we don't want all the users every single time. So for example, let's look at our request here, and maybe we want to be able to pass some resources. For example, we want to be able to pass that we want to have a page, let's say for example page 1, and we also want to pass a limit. Let's say that we want the limit here just to be 5, for example. So this is saying, give me the first page of users, and I only want 5 users from that page. Obviously, right now, if we send that request, we still get all the users. It's not actually doing anything. So let's go into our server and start implementing this. So inside of this getUsers function, we want to be able to get those variables we just passed up. So we have our page, which is equal to request.query.page, and the exact same thing for that limit variable. Now we're actually processing this page and limit request that's being sent up to us, and all we need to do is actually get the array that we're returning right now, which is all of our users, and condense that to only the specific page and the specific users in that limit range. And the easiest way to do that is to get the start index and the end index of where we're going to be querying. And the start index is actually fairly simple. All we're doing is taking our page minus 1, and we're just multiplying it, times our limit. So what it's saying is we know that our page that we're on is going to be the page we want. For example, 1 is going to be page 1, page 2 is page 2, but since arrays are 0 indexed and these pages are 1 indexed, we need to make sure we subtract 1 because page 1 is essentially the same as starting at index 0 inside our application. So 1 minus 1 would be 0 times our limit, we start at index 0. Now moving on to the end index, this is just going to be page times limit because we don't need to worry about subtracting 1 since we want to get the very end of our array and not the beginning of it. So now that we have our start index and our end index, what we can do is actually query our users to return just the users in between the start and end index. And that's actually fairly straightforward. All we need to do is say users.slice, and the slice method, we pass it a start and an end number, and it gives us everything between those. So we can just say start index and end index, and we can just use this as a result. So we can just set this to result users, and let's actually return that as our JSON. Now let's make this request again, and you can see we get users 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are just our first 5 users. If we change our page to page 2, make a request, you see we get the next 5. We get 6 through 10, and we could maybe change this to be a limit of 3. And now if we make the request, you see we get 4, 5, 6, which is the second page if you limit by 3. And now this is all great, but usually when you have a paginated API, you actually want to return somewhere inside that API what the next page would be and the previous page, so that the user knows if there is a next page or if there isn't a next page, and same thing with previous page. It just makes it easier for the client consuming the API. So in order to do this, we actually want to append extra results to here. So let's create another variable. We're just going to call this results, and we're going to set it to an empty object. And then our result users, we're just going to say results.results is going to be equal to these users, and then we want to return our results. So now in our request, if we make this again, you see we have a results section, which is going to return our array of users. Now we can actually put extra information inside of our object for the next and the previous pages. So let's do that now. Let's set up next. So we can say results.next, and this is just going to be equal to an empty or an object, and the object is going to have a page as well as a limit property. And now the limit property is going to stay exactly the same. We're just going to pass the limit they passed us, but as for the page, we actually want to pass the next page. So we can just say page plus 1. And we can do the same exact thing for previous. And as you guessed it, we just want to do page minus 1. So page minus 1, and we want this to be previous. So now if we do our request again, you'll see we have a next, which is saying page 21. And this is actually a problem. If we go back to our server, this is being passed up as a string. Same with the limit. So we want to actually parse this as an int. So we can just say parse int. And we can do the exact same thing with our limit. So we want to parse that as an integer. Now if we save this, make our request, you'll see that our page is 3, our limit's 3, and our previous page is 1 and 3. Now this works great, but what if we change to page 1? If we make our request, you're going to see our previous is page 0. And obviously this is not valid. There is no page 0. So we need to make a couple checks inside of our server. Let's start with the previous one first. We want to check to see if we have a previous page. And this is pretty easy. We just want to see if the start index is greater than 0, because this means that our array here is not starting at the very first user. Also, for our next results, we can do a very similar thing. We just want to check if our end index is less than our users.length. And we can put this inside of here. So what this is saying is that our end is somewhere before the end of our actual users array. So we have extra users to query, so we should show them the next. And now if we send a request, you see the previous section goes away. But let's say if we make our limit here to be 13, for example. Now if we save this, click send request, you see that immediately our next and previous go away because there is no next or previous section that we can go to. We can even change this down to 10, for example, save, make a request, and you can see now next actually shows up as a result because we have a next page since we have more than 10 users. Now this is the very basics of how to set up pagination, but we have to copy this code every time we want to paginate a different user. Let's say we have a different model. Let's just copy this. And let's say we have post. And we're just going to change here user to be post for all these. Just excuse all this. So now we have two different models. We have a post model and a user model, and we want to have an app.get for the post. So we can come in here, post, and of course, request, response. Now, in order to set this up, we'd have to copy all of this code like this and paste it inside a post and change all of our user variables, such as here, change those to post. And that sounds like a lot of work. So instead, what we want to do is set up some form of middleware, where essentially all we do is pass it up here. We can say paginated results, and all we would do is pass it our post. And this would actually do all of the pagination for us. We wouldn't need to do anything ourselves. So in order to do that, we need to create a function that'll handle that. So let's remove all of this code inside of here. We don't need anything inside of our post. It'll just be completely empty for now, just like that. Perfect. Now let's go all the way down, create that function. Function, and we're going to call it paginated results. And this is going to take the model that we want to paginate. And now inside of paginated results, what we need to do is a middleware function always takes request, response, and next. So we need to actually return a function which takes request, response, and next. So we can just return an arrow function like this. So normally when you create middleware, you wouldn't be able to pass anything to it. You wouldn't be able to pass this post because you're passing a function that accepts request, response, and next. But in our case, we're passing post to this paginated results, and we know that the result of this function here needs to be another function that takes request, response, and next. So down here, we're making sure we return a function that takes request, response, and next, so it'll properly work as a middleware. And the way middleware works is it actually executes before all of the code inside of your thing. So we have all this code inside of our app.get, and this middleware is going to execute before it. And if we call this next function, it'll actually move forward and call the code inside of the next section, which in our case is this get section for our users. So what we want to do inside of here is just copy almost all of this code. Let's just get all of this code from our users, copy this down inside of our paginated results, and wherever we have the word user, we want to replace this with our model. So instead of users, we're going to do model.length, and instead of slicing, we want to slice our model. So there we go. Now we actually have our results. Let's make sure we indent this properly. So now we have this results variable, but we want to save this so that we can access it inside of our app.get. So what we can do is we can actually save this to our response. What we can do is we can say res dot, and we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to call it paginated results, and we want to set that equal to our results. This is just this variable right here. And then we want to call the next function just like that. And now we can delete all of this code inside of here. And all we need to do is send down our paginated results. So we can just say result.paginated results. And all we need to do is make sure that inside of here, that we actually do paginated results and we pass it in the users. So just change this post to users here, and we can do the exact same thing in our post up here for paginated results. Let's save that. And now let's query our users and make sure it works. You can see we query and we get the exact same results, our first 10 users. And we can change this to post, hit send request, and you can see we now get our post instead. And we didn't have to copy any code. All of our code is in this paginated results section down here. And let's just kind of go through a little bit how this works. If you remember, we pass in the model we're using, for example, post or users, and then we're returning a function which acts as a middleware. And as soon as we call next, it's going to go to the next chain of events, which in our case is this function we defined here, which is returning our JSON for both of these. And we're doing just all the same stuff inside of here we were doing before. The only difference is we're actually setting the paginated results to our result variable so that we can use it later on in our chain, as you can see right here. And now that's great for setting up the basics of pagination and then extrapolating that into this middleware function here. But what if we actually want to use this inside of a database? Well, to do that, we're going to set up a very basic MongoDB database using Mongoose. So if you don't already have MongoDB installed on your computer, check out the video linked up in the cards or the description, and that'll show you exactly how to download MongoDB. And once you're done with that, you can come back to this video. So let's quit out of our server here, and we need to install a library called Mongoose, and this is just going to allow us to easily interact with our MongoDB database through this kind of wrapper that just makes it so much easier. Now that we have that installed, we can remove a lot of our boilerplate code. Let's remove these users and these post variables, and we don't actually need this post get anymore. Now, the very first thing that you need to do with MongoDB and Mongoose is to set up a schema, which will allow us to actually access MongoDB and save records in a collection. So to do that, we're just going to create a file called users.js, and this is going to be our schema. So we can import Mongoose into here, which is just going to be called require, and we want to require Mongoose just like that. And what we want to do is set up our user schema. So we can just do that here. This is going to be equal to a new mongoose.schema, and the schema is going to take all of our data, all of our properties for our user. In our case, we just have name because ID is automatically generated. And we're going to tell this that we want this to be a type of string and that we want to always require our user to have a name. So that's our very basic user schema. And the last thing is we want to export that user schema so we can use it. So we can say module.exports is going to be equal to mongoose.model. And we want to make sure that this model here has a name. In our case, we're going to call it user, and our schema, which is our user schema. And with that setup, we already have our user model created, so we can actually start creating users, saving users, and most importantly, querying and paginating our users list. So now back into our server, let's actually hook up our server to our database. So we can have in here, const mongoose is going to be equal to require of mongoose, just like that. And also, while we're at it, let's import our user. So we can just say user is going to be equal to require /users, just like that. So now we have our user model and our database connector. And to connect to our database, we just want to say mongoose.connect, and we're going to pass it the URL. Normally, this URL you would want to save in an environment variable, but for the purposes of the application here, we're just going to write it directly in this connect string. So all we need to do is say MongoDB : // and then another backslash and the name of the database we're going to be creating. We're just going to call this Pagination. It really doesn't matter what name you use. And let's just save that and start up our server to make sure it works. Again, npm run dev start, and hopefully everything is green and we have no errors. But you'll see, of course, we have an error. So let's see what that is. It says required is not defined. And it looks like here, I didn't put true for required. I just forgot that property. Now if we save that and check, you can see again, we're having an error and it's saying users is not defined. And that's of course because we don't actually have our users variable. We're going to change this to our user model. And now everything should work properly. And we're getting some deprecation warnings. And this is actually okay. What it's pretty much saying is that Mongoose goes back and uses some older versions of MongoDB. And we just want to tell it to use the new version. So let's just copy this code and paste it in here. We need to use the new URL parser. And we also want to use the unified topology. So we can paste that in here, also with a value of true. Now if we save, you can see our deprecation warnings have gone away. And depending on when you actually watch this video and implement this, you may have more or less deprecation warnings that you need to worry about. Just copy over the code if you do have them, and it should work just fine. Now the next thing we need to do is just populate some default data inside of our model the very first time our app loads up. Normally you wouldn't need to do this, but since we have an empty database, we need to add some data to it. So Mongoose actually gives us a really great tool to connect to the database. We can just say mongoose.connection, and this is going to be our database. So we can just say const db is going to be equal to that. Then we can say db.once. So the very first time that we open up our database, so we'll say open, we want to run some function just like this. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. So let's just put async in here, whoops, just like that. And inside of here, the very first thing we want to do is check if we have any users. So we're going to say users.count documents, just like this. This will give us the count of all documents if we execute it. And we want to check to see if that's greater than 0. And since this is asynchronous, we just want to await this, just like that, whoops. And now it's saying if we have any users in our database, all we want to do is return, because after here, we're going to actually implement adding our users to the database. So if we have users, we just want to return so we don't add even more users. We don't want to have duplicate users. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use promise.all, so we can just execute a bunch of code inside of these promises. And we'll just have a simple .then at the end, which is just going to log out for us, console.log added users. So inside of here, we're going to add all of our different users. And we can do this by just saying user.create, and we just want to pass it in a name. And the name here is going to be user1, just like that. Put a comma at the end, and we're just going to do this a bunch of times so that we have a bunch of different users, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. same old, 10, 11, 12, just like that. And now if we save this, you should see after a little bit of waiting that we should have printed out for us console.log added users. And as you can see, it's added all of the users for us down here, so we know that everything's working for us. And if we save this again, you should see that the added users doesn't show up because it's actually returning out here because it recognizes that we have users. Now with all of that out of the way, we're finally ready to actually implement the pagination for our database. We have users in the database, and now we can actually do the pagination. And this is going to be very similar to how our pagination worked before. We can actually keep all of this code up here at the beginning exactly the same. We can keep all this code for start and end index exactly the same. The only thing that's going to change is how we actually query our model. So what we want to do is we want to find users, and we want to find all the users, so we're not going to pass anything inside of our find. And then what we want to do is we want to limit how many users we have to the limit that we got passed in. So this will only return 5 users if we pass a limit of 5. And in order to start at the right section, we just want to make sure we skip. And the skip is going to take a number which is going to skip to. In our case, we want to skip to our start index and then only get the next however many we limit units. And then we can just run the exec function. And of course, we want to make sure that we await this because this is asynchronous code. And we can wrap this inside of a try catch. So inside of the try here, we just want to put this actual code, and we want to make sure that we call our next inside of the try if that executed successfully. If, for example, we had an error in here, all we want to do is catch that error, and we want to send that error to the user. So we want to just come in here and we want to say res.status, just like that. We want to send a status of 500, and we just want to have a simple JSON message. So we can say message is e.message. And of course, we also want to make sure we set our request, our response, paginated results, just like this. And we don't need this arrow here. I don't know what I was thinking with that. Now if we save that, you can see that we have an error with the application. It says await is only valid in async functions. And of course, we just need to make this an async function. Now if we save that, everything is green down here. So let's actually try to query our users and see if this works. All we need to do is change this to users here instead of post. So we got users. And let's make sure that we query, let's say, a limit of 3, and we want to start at the second page. Let's send that request. And you can see we have our previous being shown up with page 1, a limit of 3, our results being shown up for users 4, 5, and 6. But for some reason, our next is not showing up. We must have some kind of error with our next. So let's go and make sure that we check why our next is not showing up. Inside of our server, if we go all the way down here, you can see obviously our model.length. There is no length to our model. What we need to do instead is actually check the count of our documents, and of course execute that and make sure we await that. Now if we save that, go over here, send this request, you can see next is properly showing up. And if we make our limit really large, for example, we make it 14, and we set our page to 1, send our request, you can see that next and previous no longer show up because there is no next or previous page to go to. And that is how you do everything from the most simple pagination to the most complex database related pagination. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.